Here at the beginning of 1963, the holiday's just over. Most Americans have just known a time of good food, presents, and family. And they probably think that's the way all Americans live. But it's not true, because during these holidays just past, there were millions and even tens of millions of Americans who were poor, who were miserable in body and in spirit. A lot of times we think that in these United States, the people all live in fine brick, stone, elevator-type apartments with heat, like some of the ones you've just seen. But actually, very close to here, right over the hill, up that way, there are streets. We've been told of them by President Eisenhower's Civil Rights Commission that they are so dense, so packed with human beings, that if the rest of America were like them, we could fit the entire population of the United States of America into 3 boroughs of New York. The tragic thing about this, in this 1963, is that many of us, and perhaps most of us who have known the good holiday season, don't know that these people exist. There once was a time in America when the poor, in a sense, were our strength, when the poor were the immigrants, when the slums were teeming places of people who were on the verge of hope, who were entering into the society. But now more and more, and this is the tragedy of poverty 1963, more and more the slums are not the way stations of hope for immigrants, they are prisons for people who are caught there. For example, they're the old people in the United States, over half of them, about 8 or 9 million people, who are not only poor in income, but who are sick, who are living alone, who are frustrated, who are in neighborhoods that they don't understand. There are Negroes in the United States, Negroes who work at 58% of the white wage. There are farm workers. There are workers in the coal fields whose jobs have been destroyed by automation. But perhaps most tragic of all to think about at the beginning of this new year is the fact that the recent unemployment statistics indicate that most of that new unemployment comes from young people. That today, when a young person drops out of high school, when a young person doesn't have the skill and education that a society of automation requires, he probably doesn't have a chance for the rest of his life. The thing we have to think about today is that we may be, for the first time in our history in these United States, on the verge of having a hereditary poor, a permanent poor. And the real tragedy is that at this very moment, where we have in our grasp with our technology, with our productivity, with our science, we have right there in our grasp the possibility of realizing man's immemorial dream of, for the first time in history, abolishing poverty. At this moment, perhaps we are creating a hereditary poor.
Let's take a look at the idea of the affluent society and the idea that everyone is well off. One economist who asked that question and came up with some disturbing answers this year was Dr. Herman Miller, Special Assistant to the Director of the United States Census Bureau. Dr. Miller, what about the other America, as some people call it? What about the old idea we had that poverty in the United States was being solved by a more even distribution of income? Is this a myth?
Yes, I would say that it is a myth. I think if you look at the figures carefully, you'll find that there has been no change in income distribution in the United States for about 20 years. For example, if you look at the share of income that the poorest fifth of the families receive, it has not changed. If you compare the incomes of the Negroes and the whites, it has not changed. In fact, the higher paid workers have made bigger gains in the past 10 years than the lower paid workers. So any way you look at the numbers, I would say there has been no change in income distribution for nearly a generation. You know, Will Rogers once said that this is the only country that ever rode to the poorhouse in an automobile. And there's a lot of truth to that observation. I think even the poor in the United States have levels of living that are the envy of the rest of the world. But that's no reason for complacency. Our poor live here and now. They don't live in Russia and they don't live in China. And they feel entitled to a share in the decent levels of living that we have, and there are millions of people who don't get that. Now, who are the poor now? Well, I would say that my best approximation is that it's our poorest fifth of the families. That is the 10 million families that have incomes under $3,000. This is a very rough figure, but I think it's a pretty good working point. And when you break the figures down that way, you'll find that our poor are farmers, they're aged, they're broken families, widows, they're Negroes, and there are many, many poor whites.
And isn't it true that even if all incomes rise, if the percentages remain what you have suggested, and if the 10 million families have as low incomes as they have, that one must begin to concern himself with who is on top of the pyramid and who are on bottom?
I think that's a very important question for many reasons, but let me give you just one. There is some evidence that poverty is transmitted from one generation to the next, that poor people have children who in turn grow up and become poor people. And there's a danger that this will give us a low-income caste, you might say. Now, the dream and hope of the American society is that it would be a fluid one, that the child reared in a poor family could one day move out of that class himself. And we must keep this dream alive, and that's why this is such a very important problem.
Isn't it true that a very large percentage of the middle class today, of the professions, of the relatively well-off, are in fact children of parents who were poor, who were immigrants?
Yes, this is a fact, but it's a different kind of, that was a different kind of poverty. I think the poverty that the people you speak about had was a poverty that was mixed with hope, with aspiration, with education. I think today, in many places, you find a poverty of despair, a poverty of ignorance, and that would find itself very difficult to get out of.
And Dr. Miller, as an economist, what do you think is the way out?
Well, this is a very difficult question, obviously. There are many answers. I think I can identify at least three major things we have to do. First of all, we must maintain full employment. This won't help some of the poor, like the aged and the widows, but if the lower income people have jobs, if they have regular employment, their incomes will at least be kept up. Secondly, we must put an end to discrimination in education and employment. We must equalize opportunities. If the children of the poor aren't educated, they'll never rise above the levels of their parents. Once you educate a man and you don't give him a job, he becomes cynical. He develops despair. So we must equalize opportunities. And third, we must try to stop this transmission of poverty from one generation to the next. We must make a very strenuous effort to find the best talents among the poor and to see that they are developed. I think this won't certainly cure the problem, but it'll alleviate it a great deal.